Machiavellianism. Someone at work takes credit for your idea in a meeting. Not by accident. Not because they forgot. They watched you build it, waited for the right moment, then presented it as theirs. When you try to object, they've already positioned themselves so perfectly that calling them out makes you look petty. By the time you realize what happened, the damage is done. That's not opportunism. That's calculation. Some people treat every interaction like a chess game where other people are pieces to be moved. This is Machiavellianism. It's not about being cruel for the sake of it. It's about being willing to manipulate, deceive, and exploit when it serves a goal. Emotion doesn't cloud the decision. Guilt doesn't slow it down. The question isn't, is this wrong? It's, does this work? The principle is simple. Outcomes matter more than methods. If lying gets you closer to what you want, you lie. If betraying trust opens a door, you walk through it. If someone's loyalty becomes inconvenient, you cut them loose. No moral wrestling. Just strategy. The mechanisms are surgical. First, they read people. Not to connect, but to find leverage. They notice who needs validation, who fears conflict, who trusts too easily. Then they use it. They don't charm you because they like you. They charm you because a warm relationship gives them access, information, or cover when they need it. Next, they control perception. They don't just act. They control how the action is seen. The credit stealer didn't just take your idea. They framed the context, shaped the narrative, made sure that by the time you spoke up, the room had already moved on. The theft wasn't visible because the setup made it invisible. And here's the coldest part. They don't lose sleep over it. The internal alarm that says, this is wrong. It either doesn't fire, or it gets overridden by a louder voice that says, this is useful. The emotional cost that would paralyze someone else doesn't register. You see it everywhere. The coworker who befriends you only when they need something, then vanishes the moment you're no longer valuable. The partner who lies smoothly, not out of panic, but because the truth is inconvenient and a lie is easy. The leader who promises loyalty but discards people the second a better option appears. Relationships aren't connections. They're tools. Affection, trust, collaboration, all of it gets filtered through a cost-benefit analysis. If keeping you around serves them, they keep you. If it doesn't, you're gone. And they won't feel bad about it. Machiavellianism hides in plain sight. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like confidence, ambition, social skill. By the time you realize someone has been playing you, they've already moved 3 steps ahead. And you can't even call it out without sounding paranoid, because they've made sure the evidence points somewhere else. Alexithymia. Why do some people freeze when you ask them how they're feeling? Not because they don't want to tell you. Because they genuinely don't know. They feel something. A tightness in the chest. A knot in the stomach. A heaviness that sits there like static. But when you ask them to name it, to explain it, the words just aren't there. It's not avoidance. It's absence. A friend cancels plans last minute. You ask if everything's okay. They say, I'm fine. But their voice is flat, their face is blank, and something's clearly wrong. You push a little. Are you upset? Stressed? Tired? They stare at you like you just asked them to solve an equation they've never seen before. Not because they're hiding it. Because they can't find it. This is alexithymia. The inability to identify and describe your own emotions. It's not about being unemotional. The feelings exist. The body reacts. The heart races, the hands shake, the throat tightens. But the internal translation system that turns those sensations into words like angry or anxious, it's broken or it was never built. For someone with alexithymia, emotions are like background noise. Present, but unprocessable. They know something is happening inside them, but they can't pin it down, can't name it, can't explain it to anyone, including themselves. So when you ask, how do you feel? They give you facts instead. I didn't sleep well. Work was busy. I have a headache. Not because they're dodging the question. Because that's the only language they have. This creates a brutal gap in relationships. If you can't identify your own emotions, you can't communicate them. And if you can't communicate them, your partner, your friend, your family is left guessing. Are you mad at me? I don't know. Do you still care about this? I don't know. It's not cruelty. It's helplessness. The other person is stuck trying to navigate a relationship with someone who can't give them a map. It shows up everywhere. A breakup happens and they feel something. But they can't cry, can't process it, can't talk it through because they don't have the internal vocabulary. So they go numb. They move on, not because they're over it, but because they don't know how to stay in it. A promotion falls through, and instead of disappointment, there's just a vague heaviness they can't explain, so they bury themselves in work and never address it. Therapy becomes nearly impossible. What brought you here today? I don't know. I just feel off. Can you describe what off feels like? Silence. Because there's nothing to describe. The sensation exists, but the translation doesn't. It's like trying to explain a color you've never seen. And here's the worst part. People around them get frustrated. Why won't you just tell me what's wrong? But there's nothing to tell. The emotion is there locked inside, but the key to access it is missing. So they stay silent. Not out of stubbornness, but out of inability. And relationships crack under the weight of that silence. Not because anyone wanted them to, but because one person couldn't find the words and the other person couldn't stop needing them. Sensation seeking. Some people can't sit still. Not in the restless sense, in the hunger sense. The world at normal speed feels like waiting. A predictable day feels like suffocation. Routine isn't just boring. It's unbearable. So they chase the next rush, the next risk, the next thing that makes them feel awake. You see it in the friend who's never satisfied with a quiet weekend. They're already planning the next trip, the next party, the next thing that breaks the pattern. At work, they thrive in chaos but shut down during steady periods. In relationships, the early thrill is electric, but the moment things stabilize, they start looking for the exit. This drive has a name: sensation seeking. It's a personality trait that craves novelty, intensity, and stimulation. For someone high in sensation seeking, calm isn't peaceful. It's empty. Their brain is wired to seek out experiences that spike arousal. Adrenaline, excitement, unpredictability. The baseline most people find comfortable registers as numbness. The mechanism is biological. Their nervous system has a higher threshold for stimulation. What feels intense to most people barely registers. So they push harder. Extreme sports, impulsive decisions, substance use, new relationships, risky choices. Not because they're reckless, but because they're trying to feel something that matches the intensity they need. But here's the trap. The more they chase, the higher the threshold climbs. What used to excite them stops working. The rush fades faster, so they escalate. A weekend trip becomes a month abroad. A night out becomes a binge. A flirtation becomes an affair. They're not trying to destroy their life. They're trying to feel alive in it. And the cost builds quietly. Jobs don't last because routine becomes unbearable. Relationships don't last because stability feels like stagnation. Friendships strain because people can't keep up with the constant need for motion. They're always moving, always chasing, never landing. And in the stillness, when it finally catches up, they don't know who they are without the noise. Sensation seeking isn't about lacking discipline. It's about needing the volume turned up just to hear the signal. But when nothing at normal intensity can reach you anymore, you're not free. You're just running. Rejection sensitivity. A text goes unanswered for 2 hours. Not unusual. People get busy. But the silence starts to build. You check your phone. Once. Twice. 10 times. By the third hour, you've already rewritten the entire relationship. They're pulling away. You said something wrong. They're done with you, and by the time they finally reply with sorry, was in a meeting, the damage is already done. You've spent 3 hours convinced you were being abandoned. That's rejection sensitivity, the inability to let ambiguity stay ambiguous. For someone high in rejection sensitivity, neutral interactions don't stay neutral. They get reinterpreted as rejection, even when there's no evidence. A delayed response becomes intentional distance. A cancelled plan becomes proof they don't care. A brief tone becomes confirmation that you're too much. The pattern is exhausting. You scan every interaction for signs of rejection. A friend seems distracted during lunch. You replay the conversation, searching for what you did wrong. A coworker doesn't laugh at your joke. You spiral into whether they actually like you. Someone takes a while to text back. You've already written the script where they're cutting you out. And the worst part is, you know it's irrational. You know people get busy mistexts of bad days. But knowing doesn't stop the fear. The moment uncertainty appears, your brain fills it with rejection. Not as a possibility, as a certainty. This creates a vicious cycle. The more you fear rejection, the more you see it. And the more you see it, the more you react. You withdraw to protect yourself. Or you overcompensate, texting too much, apologizing when you don't need to, trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist. Either way, the relationship starts to bend under the pressure. And then the rejection you feared becomes real. Not because it was inevitable, but because your fear of it shaped the outcome. Rejection sensitivity doesn't make you weak. But it makes every relationship feel like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, one delayed text, one misread tone, and you're convinced it's over. You're not overreacting to what happened. You're reacting to what you're certain is coming. And by the time you realize it wasn't, you've already lived through the ending in your head. Narcissism. Have you ever met someone who can't stop talking about themselves? Not in the oversharing way. In the everything loops back to me way. You mention a problem. They one-up it with their own. You share good news. They redirect to their achievement. You need support. They make it about how hard it is for them to help you. At first, it seems like confidence. They walk into a room like they own it. They talk like they're the most interesting person there. And maybe at the start it's even charming. But spend enough time around them, and the pattern becomes clear. Every conversation is a performance where they're the star and you're the audience. This is narcissism. Not the clinical diagnosis, but the personality trait. It's characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for how others feel. They genuinely believe they're special, more talented, more deserving, more interesting than everyone else. And they need you to believe it too. But here's what's hidden underneath. That confidence is brittle. Scratch the surface and the defensiveness shows. Criticize them even gently and watch the reaction. They don't just disagree. They attack. They deflect. They make you the problem. Because to a narcissist, criticism isn't feedback. It's a threat to the entire identity they've built. The lack of empathy isn't cruelty. It's blindness. They can't see past their own experience. When you're upset, they don't ask why. They tell you you're overreacting. When you succeed, they don't celebrate. They feel eclipsed. Your emotions only matter when they affect them. Your needs only register when they align with theirs. And relationships become transactional. You're valuable as long as you validate them. Praise them. Admire them. Reflect back the image they need to see. But the moment you stop, or worse, the moment you need something from them, the warmth disappears. You're not a person. You're a mirror. And if you stop reflecting what they want, they'll find someone else who will. Living around narcissism is exhausting. You learn to shrink yourself, to manage their reactions, to avoid anything that might trigger the defensiveness or the cold withdrawal. And slowly, without realizing it, the relationship stops being about connection. It becomes about keeping them satisfied. Because when a narcissist's ego is the center of gravity, everything else orbits around it, including you. Need for closure. A meeting ends without a clear decision. The project is still open. The timeline is vague. Everyone else seems fine with it. We'll figure it out later. But you're not fine. The uncertainty sits in your chest like an unfinished sentence. You need a plan, a deadline, an answer. Anything to close the loop. This discomfort with ambiguity isn't just preference. For some people, it's a psychological need. Need for closure is the drive to have a definite answer, any answer, rather than sitting in uncertainty. When something is unresolved, it doesn't just linger. It gnaws. Open-ended questions feel like unfinished tasks. Ambiguity feels like a problem that needs solving right now. The trait shows up everywhere. In conversations, they push for conclusions. So what are we doing? What's the plan? Just decide. In relationships, they want clarity. Are we together or not? Where is this going? They're not being controlling. They're trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing. Uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable. It's intolerable. And here's how it operates. When faced with ambiguity, the brain creates pressure to resolve it. For someone with high need for closure, that pressure is relentless. They'll make a decision, sometimes any decision, just to stop the feeling. Better a bad answer than no answer. Better a closed door than one left open. But this creates problems. Quick decisions aren't always good decisions. Relationships get pressured into commitments before they're ready. Projects get locked into plans before all the information is in. Nuance gets flattened because nuance is ambiguous, and ambiguity has to be eliminated. They also struggle with changing circumstances. Once they've closed the loop, reopening it feels like regression. We already decided this. New information doesn't feel like an update. It feels like a disruption. So they resist it. They defend the closure even when the closure was premature. And in relationships, this becomes a source of friction. The partner who needs more time to think feels rushed. The friend who's okay with, let's see what happens, feels pressured. The need for closure isn't negotiable for the person who has it, but to everyone else it feels like impatience, like control, like an inability to just let things unfold. Need for closure isn't about being rigid. It's about needing the world to stop shifting long enough to feel steady. But when you can't tolerate uncertainty, you end up forcing resolution before it's earned. And that doesn't bring clarity. It just brings the illusion of it. Psychopathy. Most people feel guilt when they hurt someone. The remorse comes automatically. You see the pain you caused and something inside you recoils. But for some people, that signal never fires. They can lie, manipulate, or harm without the emotional cost that stops everyone else. Not because they're trying to suppress it. Because it's not there. This detachment from guilt is one marker of psychopathy. It's not about being violent or criminal. Most people with psychopathic traits live ordinary lives. They hold jobs. They have relationships. They blend in. What sets them apart is the absence of emotional depth that others take for granted. Psychopathy operates on a few core features: shallow emotions, lack of empathy, superficial charm, impulsivity. They can mimic care, but they don't feel it. They understand intellectually that certain behaviors upset people, but the emotional resonance is missing. It's like watching someone cry and knowing you're supposed to comfort them, but feeling nothing. The charm is real, but it's tactical. They're often magnetic, charismatic, engaging. But the warmth is a tool, not a connection. They read social cues, mirror what people want to see, and use it to get what they need. The relationship feels genuine until you realize it only exists as long as you're useful. And here's what makes it hard to detect. They're not constantly cruel. They can be generous, funny, attentive, when it serves them. But the moment you stop being valuable, the mask doesn't slip. It just stops being worn. The person who seemed so invested in you becomes indifferent, and you're left wondering what changed. Nothing changed. You were always a means to an end. In relationships, the pattern reveals itself slowly. The early stage is intense. They're attentive, affectionate, everything you wanted. But over time, the inconsistency shows. They lie without hesitation. They break promises without guilt. They hurt you, and when confronted, they don't apologize. They justify. They deflect. They make it your fault. Psychopathy doesn't mean someone is dangerous. But it does mean they're operating without the internal brake that makes most people care about the harm they cause. And once you realize that, the relationship becomes a negotiation with someone who has no emotional investment in your well-being. Only in what you can do for them. Intolerance of uncertainty. The test results won't be back for 3 days. The doctor said it's probably nothing. Everyone around you seems calm. But you can't stop running scenarios. What if it's serious? What if they missed something? What if the wait means it's already too late? By day 2, you've convinced yourself the delay is a bad sign. Most people can sit with quill C. For some, that phrase is unbearable. The space between question and answer fills with dread. They need to know now, even if the knowing is bad news. Uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable. It's a threat the mind can't tolerate. This is intolerance of uncertainty. It's the inability to function when outcomes are unclear. Where most people can wait, they spiral. Where others shrug and move on, they obsess. The unknown doesn't stay neutral. It becomes catastrophic. And the mind tries to fix it. If you can't get certainty, you create it. You Google symptoms until you find the worst-case diagnosis. You replay the conversation until you're sure they were upset. You check your bank account 5 times because the number might have changed. It doesn't bring real certainty, but it gives the illusion of control, and that's better than nothing. But here's the trap. The more you try to eliminate uncertainty, the more sensitive you become to it. Every small ambiguity starts to feel like a crisis. A vague text. A delayed email. A meeting without a clear agenda. Each one triggers the same loop. The tolerance doesn't build, it shrinks. Relationships suffer under this weight. Your partner says, "We need to talk," and you spend the next hour convinced they're leaving. A friend takes longer to respond than usual, and you assume you've done something wrong. You push for clarity when there's nothing to clarify, and the constant need for reassurance exhausts the people around you. And decisions become paralysis, because making a choice means living with the uncertainty of whether it was right. So you delay. You gather more information. You ask for more opinions. But no amount of data makes the decision feel certain, so you keep searching. And while you search, the opportunity closes. The uncertainty you were trying to avoid becomes the only thing you're left with. Neuroticism. Some people feel everything louder. A minor criticism doesn't just sting. It spirals into self-doubt that lasts for days. A friend's bad mood doesn't register as their issue. It becomes proof that you did something wrong. The emotional volume is always turned up, and there's no way to turn it down. This heightened emotional reactivity is neuroticism. It's one of the core personality traits, and it governs how intensely someone experiences negative emotions. Anxiety, guilt, sadness, anger. For someone high in neuroticism, these feelings don't just visit. They take over. The brain's threat detection system is overactive. A neutral event gets flagged as a problem. A minor inconvenience registers as a crisis. The internal alarm that's supposed to fire for real danger fires constantly. And once it fires, it doesn't reset easily. The worry doesn't fade when the moment passes. It lingers. It builds. At work, a single piece of feedback becomes evidence that you're failing. At home, a quiet evening with your partner feels like distance, and the distance feels like the beginning of the end. You know, rationally, that you're overreacting. But knowing doesn't stop the feeling. The emotion arrives with full force, and logic can't override it. And the exhaustion is cumulative. Every day brings a dozen small triggers. A text that takes too long to answer. A meeting that didn't go perfectly. A look from someone that might have been disapproval. Each one sparks the same internal spiral, and by the end of the day, you're drained from managing feelings that other people didn't even have. People around you start to notice. You apologize too much. You need reassurance constantly. You interpret ambiguity as rejection. And while they try to be supportive, the pattern wears on them. They can't always manage your emotions on top of their own. So they pull back, which only confirms the fear that drove the behavior in the first place. Neuroticism isn't a choice. It's not about being weak or dramatic. It's about living in a mind where the emotional thermostat is stuck on high. And every interaction, every decision, every moment of uncertainty carries a weight that other people don't feel. You're not overreacting to the world. You're reacting accurately to the intensity your brain assigns to it. Self-monitoring. Watch someone at a party. Some people are the same no matter who they're talking to. Same energy. Same opinions. Same jokes. But others shift. With one group, they're animated and opinionated. With another, they're reserved and agreeable. They're not faking. They're adjusting. Reading the room and modifying themselves to fit it. This ability to adapt your behavior based on social cues is called self-monitoring. People high in self-monitoring are constantly scanning the environment. What's expected here? What's valued? What will make this interaction smooth? And then they become that. It's not dishonesty. It's flexibility. They genuinely believe different versions of themselves are appropriate for different contexts. The version of them at work isn't false. Neither is the version at home. They're both real. Just tailored. And in many ways, it works. High self-monitors are socially skilled. They know how to make people comfortable. They can navigate conflicting expectations without creating friction. They're good at networking, at managing impressions, at getting along with people who have nothing in common. But there's a cost. When you're always adjusting, it's hard to know what's real. Which opinions are actually yours? Which behaviors reflect who you are versus who the situation needed you to be? After enough shifts, the core starts to blur. You become so good at being what's expected that you lose track of what you wanted. And relationships get complicated. Because the person someone falls in love with might be the version you performed, not the one you'd be if you stopped performing. When you're high in self-monitoring, intimacy requires letting someone see the unedited version. But if you've spent years adapting, you might not remember what that version looks like. Low self-monitors have the opposite problem. They're consistent but rigid. They don't adjust to the room. They say what they think regardless of the audience. It makes them authentic, but it also makes them difficult. They don't smooth social friction. They create it. The balance is somewhere in the middle. Enough flexibility to navigate the world. Enough consistency to know who you are when no one's watching. But for people on either extreme, that balance stays out of reach. Dark Triad. There are people who charm you effortlessly, manipulate without guilt, and walk away from the wreckage without looking back. They're not scattered across 3 separate categories. Often, they're the same person, and the combination makes them far more effective than any single trait alone. The Dark Triad refers to 3 overlapping personality traits: Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and Psychopathy. Individually, each is difficult. Together, they create a personality profile that's ruthlessly effective at getting what it wants and unbothered by who gets hurt in the process. Narcissism brings the inflated self-image and the need for admiration. They believe they're special, entitled, deserving. This creates the motivation. They want more because they think they deserve more. Machiavellianism adds the strategy. It's the willingness to manipulate, deceive, and exploit to achieve goals. No moral hesitation, just calculation. Psychopathy removes the emotional barrier. The lack of empathy and guilt means the strategies that would make most people uncomfortable don't register as wrong. They're just tools. Put them together, and you get someone who believes they deserve everything, has no problem taking it, and feels nothing when they do. The combination shows up in predictable ways. At work, they take credit, shift blame, and sabotage competitors without hesitation. In relationships, they love bomb initially, then withdraw once you're hooked. They lie when it's convenient, cheat without guilt, and when confronted, they don't apologize. They attack. In social circles, they dominate conversations, charm the room, and quietly undermine anyone who threatens their status. And the worst part is how well it works. People high in dark triad traits are often successful. They're confident, charismatic, willing to take risks others won't. They climb hierarchies faster because they're not slowed down by fairness or empathy. And because they're skilled at impression management, most people don't see the pattern until they've already been used. The damage is always externalized. Relationships end. Colleagues burn out. Friends drift away, but the person at the center doesn't change. They move on to the next target, the next opportunity, the next person who hasn't figured them out yet. And the cycle repeats. Because when you combine the drive of narcissism, the tactics of Machiavellianism, and the emotional detachment of psychopathy, there's no internal reason to stop. Behavioral inhibition system. You're about to speak up in a meeting. You have something to say. But the moment before you open your mouth, something stops you. What if it's a bad idea? What if people judge you? What if you're wrong? The thought dies in your throat, and the meeting moves on without you. This internal break exists in everyone, but for some people, it's more sensitive. It's called the behavioral inhibition system, and it governs how your brain responds to potential threats. When it's highly reactive, even low-level risks feel like warnings. The system doesn't just say, "Be careful," it says, "Stop." The mechanism is neurological. When the brain detects something that could go wrong, a signal fires. For most people, the signal is proportional to the threat. A minor risk gets a minor warning. But for people with a highly sensitive inhibition system, the signal is loud regardless. Asking a question in class triggers the same alarm as walking into traffic. And the result is avoidance. Not because you lack courage, but because your brain is telling you the situation is dangerous. So you hold back. You stay quiet. You don't take the risk. And from the outside, it looks like shyness or anxiety. But internally, it's a survival response to threat that isn't actually there. This shows up everywhere. Social situations feel risky, so you avoid them. New experiences trigger uncertainty, so you stick with what's familiar. Conflict feels dangerous, so you never push back, even when you should. The inhibition system is protecting you from harm, but it's protecting you from everything, including growth. Relationships become difficult. You don't express needs because it might cause tension. You don't set boundaries because it might lead to rejection. You tolerate behavior you shouldn't because confrontation feels like a bigger threat than staying silent. And slowly, the relationship becomes one-sided. Not because you don't care, but because your brain won't let you risk the discomfort of speaking up. And opportunities pass by. You don't apply for the job because rejection feels unbearable. You don't start the project because failure feels catastrophic. You don't take the chance because the inhibition system screams that it's not safe. And the longer you listen to it, the smaller your world becomes. Not because the world is dangerous, but because your brain has been telling you it is for so long that you've stopped questioning it. openness to experience. Two people walk into the same art gallery. One scans the room, checks their watch, and asks when they can leave. The other stops at every piece, leans in close, asks questions, loses track of time. Same gallery, same paintings. Completely different experience. The difference isn't taste, it's wiring. Some people are built to seek novelty. New ideas excite them. Unfamiliar perspectives intrigue them. Abstract concepts don't intimidate, they invite. This drive to explore, to question, to engage with the unfamiliar is called openness to experience. It's one of the core personality traits, and it shapes how someone interacts with everything from art to arguments. People high in openness are intellectually curious. They read widely. They ask what if instead of that's how it is. They enjoy complexity. Ambiguity doesn't frustrate them. It fascinates them. A conversation about philosophy, a documentary on a topic they know nothing about, a book that challenges their assumptions. These aren't chores, they're draws. But it's not just intellectual, it's aesthetic. They notice details others miss. The way light hits a room, the structure of a sentence, the tension in a piece of music. They're drawn to beauty, strangeness, things that don't fit neatly into categories. And they're comfortable not fitting into categories themselves. Low openness operates differently. Tradition feels safer than experimentation. The familiar is preferred over the novel. Why fix what isn't broken becomes the default. Abstract art looks like a mess. Philosophical debates feel pointless. New experiences aren't exciting. They're disruptive. Neither is better. High openness can mean constant restlessness, always chasing the next idea and never settling. Low openness can mean missing out on growth because change feels threatening. But the gap between them creates friction. The person who wants to try everything clashes with the person who wants to keep things the same. And both wonder why the other doesn't see the obvious value in their approach. Behavioral activation system. There's a neurological system in your brain that drives you toward reward. When it detects something desirable, success, pleasure, recognition, it fires. You feel energized, motivated, pulled forward. This is the behavioral activation system, and how strongly it responds shapes how you move through the world. For people with a highly reactive activation system, the pull toward reward is constant. A new opportunity doesn't just seem interesting. It feels magnetic. The possibility of success, of achievement, of getting what they want activates the system so strongly that inaction becomes unbearable. They have to move toward it. This shows up as drive. Ambition. A relentless focus on goals. They're not just motivated. They're propelled. When they see a chance to win, to improve, to gain something valuable, the activation system floods them with energy. And that energy doesn't fade until the goal is reached or the opportunity passes. But here's the problem. The system doesn't distinguish between good opportunities and risky ones. It just responds to potential reward. So they chase things they shouldn't. They overcommit. They take risks that don't make sense. The pull is so strong that the rational part of their brain gets overridden. They're not reckless by choice. They're driven by a system that won't let them sit still when reward is in sight. People with a less reactive activation system experience the opposite. Opportunities don't pull them forward. They register them, consider them, but the internal drive to pursue them is weak. They're not lazy. They just don't feel the urgency. The reward isn't vivid enough to override inertia. So they stay put, not because they're content, but because the system isn't pushing them to move. And this creates a divide. The high activation person is always chasing, always pushing, sometimes burning out from the relentless pursuit. The low activation person is stable, consistent, but might miss chances because the drive to seize them never kicks in. One can't stop moving. The other struggles to start. Agreeableness. What do you do when someone cuts in front of you in line? Some people don't even blink. They let it go. It's not worth the conflict. Others feel the anger rise immediately and say something. The difference isn't just about the moment. It's about how your brain weighs harmony against fairness. Agreeableness is the trait that governs how much you prioritize getting along over being right. People high in agreeableness smooth conflict. They accommodate. They forgive quickly. They assume good intentions. When tension arises, their first instinct is to soften it, not escalate it. This makes them easy to be around. They're cooperative, empathetic, warm. In groups, they're the ones who mediate. In relationships, they're the ones who compromise. They don't pick fights. They don't hold grudges. They genuinely want people to feel comfortable, and they'll adjust themselves to make that happen. But there's a cost. High agreeableness means you absorb more than you should. You say yes when you want to say no. You let things slide that shouldn't slide. You prioritize someone else's comfort over your own boundaries. And over time, the resentment builds. Not because you're weak, but because you've been trained by your own temperament to value peace over pushback. Low agreeableness looks different. These people don't smooth tension. They create it. Not maliciously, but because they value honesty and fairness over harmony. If something bothers them, they say it. If someone's wrong, they call it out. They don't lie to make people feel better. They don't pretend to agree when they don't. This makes them difficult, but it also makes them reliable. You know where you stand. They don't harbor secret resentments. They don't manipulate through niceness. What you see is what you get. But relationships with them require thicker skin. Because they won't soften the truth to protect your feelings. The tension between high and low agreeableness is constant. One thinks the other is a pushover. The other thinks the first is an asshole. And both are partly right. Because the trait isn't about being good or bad. It's about what you optimize for. Harmony or honesty. And most people struggle to do both. Perfectionism. You finish a project. It's good. Everyone says so, but you see the flaws. The parts that could have been better. The details that aren't quite right. So instead of feeling satisfied, you feel frustrated. And instead of moving on, you keep revising. Not because anyone asked. Because the gap between what it is and what it could be won't leave you alone. This inability to accept good enough is perfectionism. It's not about wanting things to be good. Everyone wants that. It's about needing them to be flawless and feeling genuine distress when they're not. The standard isn't just high. It's often impossible. And the pursuit of it becomes a trap. Perfectionism operates in two modes. Self-oriented perfectionism is the version you impose on yourself. You set unreachable standards, then berate yourself for not meeting them. Every mistake feels like proof of inadequacy. Every flaw is evidence that you're not good enough. The gap between expectation and reality is constant, and it's exhausting. Other-oriented perfectionism is the version you impose on everyone else. You expect the same flawless execution from them that you demand of yourself. When they fall short, you're frustrated, disappointed, critical. Not because you're cruel, but because they're good enough. Doesn't meet your internal bar. And they feel it. The cost shows up everywhere. Projects take longer because you're revising endlessly. Decisions get delayed because no option is perfect. Relationships strain because people can't meet the standards you've set. And the internal monologue is relentless. This isn't good enough. You could have done better. Why can't you get this right? And here's the cruelest part. Perfectionists often produce excellent work. Their output is polished, thorough, impressive, but they never feel proud of it. Because no matter how good it is, they see the gap between what they made and the ideal version in their head. Success doesn't bring satisfaction. It brings temporary relief before the next impossible standard kicks in. The trap isn't the pursuit of excellence. It's the belief that anything less than perfect is failure. And when perfect is unattainable, you're setting yourself up for a life where nothing you do ever feels like enough. Conscientiousness. Imagine two people with the same deadline. One starts immediately, breaks the task into steps, tracks progress, finishes early. The other waits until the last minute, rushes through it, barely makes it. Both complete the task. But the process and the stress couldn't be more different. The person who started early isn't just disciplined. They're high in conscientiousness. It's a personality trait that governs self-control, organization, and goal-directed behavior. And it's one of the strongest predictors of success in almost every domain. Work, health, relationships, money. Conscientiousness correlates with all of it. People high in conscientiousness plan ahead. They follow through. They meet deadlines without drama. They're reliable. When they say they'll do something, they do it. Not because they're trying to impress anyone, because leaving things unfinished creates discomfort they can't tolerate. And it's not just about productivity. It's about impulse control. High conscientiousness means you can delay gratification. You can resist the urge to procrastinate, to skip the gym, to spend money you shouldn't. The future self gets weighted as heavily as the present self. So decisions get made with both in mind. But low conscientiousness doesn't mean laziness. It means living more in the moment. Spontaneity over structure. Flexibility over rigidity. Deadlines feel arbitrary. Plans feel restrictive. The pull of the present is stronger than the pull of future consequences. So they procrastinate. Not because they don't care, but because the discomfort of doing the task now outweighs the abstract discomfort of it being late later. And this creates real problems. Work suffers. Opportunities get missed. Responsibilities pile up. People stop trusting them because "I'll do it" doesn't reliably translate to action. But increasing conscientiousness isn't simple. It's not about trying harder. It's about fighting against a baseline tendency to prioritize immediate comfort over future outcomes. The gap between high and low conscientiousness is one of the most visible divides in daily life. One person's responsible is the other person's tight. One person's relaxed is the other person's careless. And the frustration flows both ways. Trait anxiety. There's a difference between being anxious about something and being an anxious person. The first is situational. The test is tomorrow, so you're nervous. The meeting went badly, so you're worried. But the second is constant. It's not tied to events. It's the baseline. Trait anxiety is the tendency to experience anxiety as a default state. It's not about what's happening. It's about how your nervous system interprets what's happening. For someone high in trait anxiety, the internal alarm is always at least partially activated. Even when nothing is wrong, the body acts like something might be. The physical sensations are relentless. Tight chest, shallow breathing, tension in the shoulders, a sense of dread with no clear source. And because the feeling is constant, they start searching for reasons to justify it. What am I forgetting? What could go wrong? What haven't I prepared for? The mind tries to make sense of the anxiety by finding threats, real or imagined. And once the mind finds a threat, it locks on. A small mistake at work becomes evidence you're going to get fired. A friend's short reply becomes proof they're upset with you. A physical symptom becomes a sign of serious illness. The anxiety doesn't match the situation, but it feels real. So the thoughts spiral. This exhausts relationships. People high in trait anxiety need constant reassurance. They apologize too much. They check in too often. They interpret silence as rejection and neutrality as anger. And while loved ones try to be supportive, the demands wear them down. Because no amount of reassurance makes the anxiety go away. It just quiets it temporarily. Trait anxiety isn't the same as having an anxiety disorder, but it increases the risk. Because when your baseline is already elevated, it doesn't take much to push you into clinical levels. A stressful event that someone else would handle becomes the thing that tips you over. And recovery is harder because you're not returning to calm. You're returning to low-level anxiety, which is all you've ever known. Living with trait anxiety means every day carries a weight that other people don't feel. It's not about being scared of specific things. It's about the nervous system being calibrated to threat, even when there isn't one. And that recalibration doesn't happen through willpower. It requires rewiring a system that's been running the same way for as long as you can remember. Extraversion. People assume extroverts are always happy, always energized, always. But that's not what extraversion is. It's not about being loud or outgoing or confident. It's about where you get your energy. And for extroverts, energy comes from the outside. Being around people doesn't drain them. It charges them. A quiet evening alone isn't relaxing, it's depleting. After a full day of solitude, they don't feel rested. They feel restless. The silence isn't peaceful. It's suffocating. So they reach out. They make plans. They fill the space with voices, with interaction, with stimulation. Not because they're afraid to be alone. Because alone doesn't refuel them. This is extraversion, a temperament organized around external engagement. Their nervous system is wired to seek stimulation from the environment. Conversations, activity, social energy. When those inputs are present, they feel alive. When they're absent, the world feels flat. And it's not just social, it's sensory. Extroverts are drawn to intensity, loud music, crowded spaces, fast-paced environments. The stimulation doesn't overwhelm them. It activates them. Their threshold for arousal is higher, so they need more input to reach the sweet spot where they feel engaged. But this creates misunderstandings. Introverts see extroverts constantly making plans and assume they're needy or shallow. Extroverts see introverts declining invitations and assume they're unfriendly or depressed. Neither is true. They're just running on different fuel sources. And extroverts pay a price too. The need for external stimulation means they struggle in isolation. Extended time alone doesn't lead to reflection. It leads to agitation. They don't recharge in solitude. They deteriorate. And in a world that sometimes demands quiet solo work, that puts them at a disadvantage. The trait isn't about personality in the social sense. It's about biology. Where your nervous system finds equilibrium. For extroverts, that equilibrium is out there, in the noise, in the company, in the motion. And when the world goes quiet, they don't find peace. They find discomfort. Introversion. The party is loud. People are laughing, talking over each other, moving between groups. Everyone seems energized. But you're not. You're tired. Not bored, not shy, just done. The noise, the interaction, the effort of being present, it's draining you. And all you want is to leave, go home, and sit in silence. This isn't antisocial, it's introversion. The difference between introverts and extroverts isn't about liking people or being good at conversation. It's about what costs you energy. For introverts, social interaction is expensive. Even when it's enjoyable, it depletes them. And they need solitude to recover. The nervous system of an introvert is more easily overstimulated. What feels engaging to an extrovert feels overwhelming to an introvert. Loud environments. Multiple conversations. Constant input. It's not that they can't handle it. It's that handling it requires effort. And that effort accumulates. So they protect their energy. They turn down invitations not because they don't like the people, but because they can't afford the cost. They leave early. They need breaks. They carve out time alone, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Because without it, they don't just get tired. They start to shut down. This gets misread constantly. Extroverts think introverts are unfriendly, cold, standoffish. But introverts aren't rejecting connection. They're managing capacity, the interaction that energizes an extravert exhausts an introvert. And no amount of wanting to be social changes that. Relationships become a negotiation. The extrovert wants more time together. The introvert needs more time apart. And both feel like the other doesn't understand. The extrovert feels rejected. The introvert feels pressured. And neither is wrong. They're just incompatible in how they recharge. Introversion isn't shyness. Shy people want to connect but are afraid to. Introverts aren't afraid. They're calibrated differently. Connection is meaningful, but it's costly. And they have to budget for it in a way extraverts don't. Because for them, people aren't the source of energy. They're the expense of it. Attachment anxiety. Why does silence feel like abandonment? Your partner hasn't texted in a few hours. They're busy. You know that. But the quiet builds. And with it, the fear. Are they pulling away? Did you do something? Are they losing interest? By the time they finally respond, you've already convinced yourself the relationship is ending. The fear isn't rational, but it's real, and it's relentless. You need reassurance. Constantly. Not because you're insecure in some vague sense. Because your nervous system is wired to interpret distance as danger, and the moment someone pulls back, even slightly, the alarm fires. This hypersensitivity to relationship threats is attachment anxiety. It's a pattern formed early, often in childhood, where closeness felt unstable. Love was inconsistent. Availability was unpredictable. And the lesson learned was this: people leave. So you have to hold on tight. You have to monitor constantly. You have to make sure they're still there. And in adult relationships, that shows up as clinginess. You text too much. You need reassurance too often. You interpret ambiguity as rejection. A delayed response isn't just a delayed response. It's proof they're pulling away. And the more you fear it, the more you do the things that make it happen. Because the behaviors that come from attachment anxiety push people away. The constant need for validation exhausts them. The questions: do you still love me? Are you mad? Is everything okay? Wear them down. They start to withdraw, not because they stopped caring, but because the relationship started to feel suffocating. And that withdrawal confirms the original fear. See, they were leaving all along. It's a cycle that feeds itself. The anxiety creates behaviors that create distance. The distance triggers more anxiety. And the harder you try to hold on, the faster they slip away. Not because the relationship was doomed, but because the fear of losing it became the thing that destroyed it. Breaking the cycle requires something almost impossible. You have to stop seeking reassurance when the fear spikes. You have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. You have to trust that silence doesn't mean abandonment. And when your nervous system is screaming that it does, that's not a choice. It's a fight. Attachment avoidance. There are people who don't need closeness the way others do. They're not cold. They're not damaged. They're just wired differently. Intimacy doesn't feel like safety. It feels like pressure. And the closer someone tries to get, the more they want to pull back. This is attachment avoidance, a pattern where emotional distance feels more comfortable than emotional closeness. It's not about disliking people. It's about the discomfort that arises when relationships start to demand vulnerability, dependence, or deep connection. The walls aren't there to keep people out. They're there because letting people in feels threatening. The mechanism is self-protective. At some point, usually early, closeness became associated with pain. Maybe caregivers were unreliable. Maybe dependence led to disappointment. The lesson learned was this: relying on others isn't safe. So you stop relying. You become self-sufficient. You keep relationships at a manageable distance. And that distance becomes the comfort zone. You can be friendly, charming, even affectionate, but when someone starts to need more time, more vulnerability, more commitment, you withdraw. Not consciously. It just starts to feel like too much. The relationship is encroaching, and your instinct is to create space. This confuses partners. At the beginning, everything felt fine. You were engaged, available, present. But as the relationship deepened, you started pulling back. You stopped sharing. You needed more alone time. You deflected emotional conversations. And when they asked what was wrong, you didn't have an answer. Because nothing was wrong. You were just hitting your limit for closeness. The relationship starts to feel one-sided. They're pursuing. You're retreating. They want more connection. You want more space. And the more they push, the more you pull away. Not because you don't care, but because the pressure to be close triggers the exact instinct that keeps you distant. Attachment avoidance isn't about being incapable of love. It's about the cost of intimacy feeling higher than the benefit. And when getting close means feeling trapped, distance isn't rejection. It's survival. Social dominance orientation. Watch how people react to inequality. Some see it and feel compelled to fix it. Others see it and accept it as natural. The difference isn't just political. It's deeper. It's about whether you believe hierarchies are wrong or whether you believe they're inevitable. Social dominance orientation is the degree to which someone endorses group-based hierarchy. People high in this trait don't just tolerate inequality. They see it as the way things should be. Some groups are meant to have more power, more resources, more status. And trying to flatten that structure isn't progress. It's disruption. This doesn't mean they're hateful. It means they see the world as organized into rankings, and they believe those rankings serve a function. In their view, hierarchies create order. They reward competence. They reflect natural differences. Equality isn't a moral imperative. It's a misunderstanding of how societies work, and this shapes everything. How they view social policies, how they interpret group differences, how they respond to movements for change. When someone advocates for equity, they don't hear justice. They hear an attempt to overturn a system that, in their view, works. And they resist it. Not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that some groups are simply better suited to lead, to succeed, to dominate. People low in social dominance orientation see the same world differently. Hierarchies aren't natural. They're constructed. And they're maintained through systems that favor some groups while disadvantaging others. Inequality isn't functional. It's unjust. And the moral response is to dismantle it. The divide runs deep. One side sees efforts toward equality as necessary. The other sees them as forced, unnatural, even dangerous. One believes the goal is fairness. The other believes the goal is already met, and what's being pushed is preferential treatment disguised as justice. And this isn't something you argue someone out of. It's a fundamental difference in how people perceive group dynamics. To someone high in social dominance orientation, inequality is a feature of reality. To someone low in it, inequality is a problem to solve. And neither can fully understand why the other doesn't see what seems so obvious. Empathy. Empathy isn't kindness. It's not compassion. It's not even caring. It's the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. To look at another person in pain and have that pain register inside you. Not as sympathy, as shared experience. Some people have this capacity naturally. You tell them you're struggling, and they don't just understand intellectually. They feel it. The emotion transfers. They wince when you describe hurt. They brighten when you share joy. Your emotional state becomes theirs, at least partially. And that mirroring happens automatically. This is empathy. The neurological and emotional system that allows one person to resonate with another's internal state. It's not a choice. It's a reflex. And for people high in empathy, it's both a strength and a burden. The strength is connection. Empathy makes relationships deeper. It allows people to support each other meaningfully, because they're not guessing at what the other person feels. They're experiencing a version of it themselves. When someone with high empathy says, "I understand," they often do. Not just cognitively, emotionally, but the burden is absorption. High empathy means you don't just witness other people's pain. You carry it. A friend's sadness becomes your sadness. A partner's anxiety bleeds into your nervous system. You can't just observe someone suffering. You suffer with them. And that's exhausting. It also makes boundaries difficult. When you feel what others feel, saying no becomes harder. Their disappointment doesn't stay external. It lands inside you. So you overextend. You take on problems that aren't yours. You sacrifice your own needs because the discomfort of saying no is worse than the cost of saying yes. Low empathy doesn't mean cruelty. It means emotional insulation. People low in empathy can understand that someone is upset without feeling upset themselves. They can recognize pain without absorbing it. This makes them better at maintaining boundaries, at making hard decisions, at not being swayed by emotional appeals. But it also makes connection harder. Because relationships require some level of emotional resonance, and if that's missing, the bond stays shallow. Empathy is a double-edged capacity. Too much, and you drown in other people's emotions. Too little, and you can't connect deeply enough to sustain intimacy. The balance is somewhere in the middle. Enough to feel with people. Not so much that you lose yourself in the feeling. Authoritarianism. Order feels safe. Rules create clarity. Someone needs to be in charge, and when they are, things work. This isn't just preference. For some people, it's how they organize the world. And when structure breaks down, when authority is questioned, when people stop following the established order, it doesn't just feel chaotic. It feels dangerous. This need for hierarchy and obedience defines authoritarianism. People high in this trait value tradition, respect for authority and conformity to social norms. They're not drawn to freedom and individual choice. They're drawn to structure and collective order. And they believe society functions best when people know their place and follow the rules. The worldview is threat-based. The world is seen as dangerous, and the only protection is strong leadership and clear boundaries. Outsiders are viewed with suspicion. Deviance is seen as a crack in the foundation. Questioning authority isn't healthy skepticism. It's destabilization. And when the structure is threatened, the response is to tighten control, not loosen it. This shows up in how they respond to change. New ideas feel risky. Social movements that challenge norms feel like attacks on order itself. They don't see protests as expressions of freedom. They see them as chaos. And their instinct is to restore stability, even if that means limiting freedom. In relationships, the pattern appears as rigidity. There's a right way to do things, and deviation from that way creates tension. They value loyalty and obedience. Disagreement isn't just a difference of opinion. It's disrespect. And flexibility feels like weakness, not adaptation. Low authoritarianism operates from a different premise. Authority isn't inherently legitimate. It has to be earned. Rules aren't valuable because they exist. They're valuable if they're just. And when tradition conflicts with fairness, fairness wins. This creates constant friction with high authoritarians who see that stance as naive at best and dangerous at worst. Neither view is about intelligence. It's about what feels safe. For authoritarians, safety is structure, and when the structure is threatened, tightening it isn't oppression. It's protection. Hostility. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Most people get annoyed for a moment, then let it go. But some people don't let it go. The anger stays. It builds. And for the rest of the drive, they're replaying it, imagining what they should have done, feeding the irritation until it's no longer about the car. It's about everything. This tendency to experience anger quickly and intensely is called hostility. It's not the same as aggression. Aggression is the behavior. Hostility is the emotion. And for people high in hostility, anger is always close to the surface. Small provocations trigger it. Perceived slights ignite it. And once it's there, it doesn't fade easily. The world looks antagonistic to them. People aren't just making mistakes. They're being inconsiderate, disrespectful, deliberately difficult. A neutral comment gets interpreted as criticism. A delay gets interpreted as sabotage. The assumption is that others are acting with bad intent, and the anger responds to that assumption as if it were fact. And this warps relationships, because when you're constantly interpreting people's actions as attacks, you're constantly defending yourself. You snap at small things. You hold grudges. You see conflict where others see normal interaction. And people around you start walking on eggshells, trying not to trigger the next flare-up. The cost is cumulative. Chronic hostility wears on your body. The anger keeps your stress response elevated. Your blood pressure stays high. Your immune system stays suppressed. You're not just emotionally exhausted. You're physiologically breaking down. And the relationships deteriorate. People stop being honest with you because honesty triggers anger. They stop asking for help because requests feel like impositions. They start avoiding you, not because they don't care, but because interacting with you has become unpredictable and draining. And the isolation confirms what you already believed. People are unreliable. The world is hostile, and the anger was justified all along. Trait shame. What's the difference between feeling ashamed of something you did and feeling ashamed of who you are? The first is specific. You made a mistake, and the shame is proportional, but the second is global. The mistake isn't the problem. You are, and that shame doesn't attach to an action. It attaches to your existence. For people high in trait shame, this is the baseline. Mistakes don't feel like errors. They feel like proof. Proof that you're flawed. Inadequate. Less than. And the shame isn't just an emotional reaction to failure. It's a lens through which you see yourself constantly. Even when things go well, the shame is there, waiting for the next confirmation that you were right about yourself all along. The internal monologue is brutal. Of course you messed that up. What did you expect? Of course they didn't choose you. Why would they? The shame doesn't need new evidence. It reinterprets everything as validation. Success is luck or a fluke. Failure is who you really are, and it shapes behavior in predictable ways. You avoid situations where you might fail because the failure won't just hurt. It will confirm the deepest fear. You don't take risks. You don't put yourself forward. You shrink. Not because you lack ambition, but because exposing yourself to potential failure feels like offering proof of what you already believe. Relationships become difficult. You assume people see you the way you see yourself, so compliments feel false. Affection feels conditional. You're waiting for them to realize what you already know, that you're not worth it. And that expectation creates the distance you feared, because people can't sustain a relationship with someone who refuses to believe they're valued. Shame also silences. You don't talk about struggles because admitting them feels like admitting failure. You don't ask for help because needing help is weakness. So you suffer alone, convinced that if people knew the real you, they'd leave. And the isolation deepens the shame, because now you're failing at connection too. Breaking trait shame isn't about positive thinking. It's about learning that mistakes are actions, not identity. That failing doesn't mean you are a failure, and that the voice telling you you're not enough isn't truth. It's just the loudest one. Trait guilt. You cancel plans because you're exhausted. But the moment you do, the guilt hits. They're disappointed. You let them down. You should have pushed through. And even though you know rest is necessary, the guilt doesn't care. It tells you that taking care of yourself came at someone else's expense, and that makes it wrong. This chronic sense of having done something wrong is trait guilt. It's not situational guilt, where you feel bad because you actually harmed someone. It's the persistent feeling that you're failing people, even when you're not. The internal standard is so high that almost anything feels like a transgression. And the guilt is constant. People high in trait guilt don't just feel bad when they make mistakes. They feel bad when they don't do enough. When they say no. When they prioritize themselves. The message is always the same: you should have done more. You should have tried harder. You're falling short. And the behavior becomes compensatory. You overcommit because saying no feels like letting people down. You apologize excessively because even minor inconveniences feel like your fault. You carry the emotional weight of everyone else's problems because if you don't, you're not doing enough. And the guilt drives you to exhaust yourself trying to meet a standard that's impossible. Relationships get complicated. You're so focused on not disappointing people that you lose track of your own needs. You don't set boundaries because boundaries feel selfish. You don't ask for what you want because wanting something feels like imposing. And slowly you become a version of yourself that exists to serve others, and the resentment builds underneath the guilt. The cruelest part is that trait guilt doesn't respond to reality. You can do everything right, meet every expectation, sacrifice endlessly, and the guilt still whispers that it's not enough. Because the guilt isn't about what you did. It's about the impossibility of ever being good enough. And that bar doesn't lower. It just keeps rising. Negative affectivity. Two people face the same minor setback. One shrugs it off, adjusts, moves on. The other feels the disappointment settle in like a weight. The frustration lingers. The worry builds. And by the end of the day, the small setback has colored everything. Not because they chose to dwell on it. Because their emotional system amplifies the negative and holds on to it. This tendency to experience negative emotions more frequently and intensely is called negative affectivity. It's not depression. It's not anxiety. It's a trait-level pattern where the default emotional state leans toward distress, sadness, irritability, worry, fear. These aren't occasional visitors. They're constant background noise. The brain's negativity bias is turned up. Neutral events get interpreted as slightly negative. Minor problems get interpreted as serious. And positive experiences don't fully register because the system is already scanning for what could go wrong. So even in good moments, there's an undercurrent of unease. A sense that it won't last. That something bad is coming. This exhausts relationships. When you're around someone high in negative affectivity, the emotional weather is rarely clear. There's always something wrong. Always something to worry about. And while they're not trying to bring others down, the constant negativity drains the people around them. Optimism feels naive. Reassurance feels dismissive. And eventually people stop trying to lighten the mood because it never works. The cost is also internal. Living in a state of chronic negative emotion takes a toll. Sleep suffers. Energy depletes. Motivation drops. Not because anything catastrophic happened, but because the baseline state is one of mild distress. And that distress never fully lifts. Negative affectivity isn't a choice. It's a temperament. And people who have it aren't being dramatic or pessimistic. They're experiencing the world through a filter that highlights threats, amplifies discomfort, and mutes joy. And no amount of positive thinking changes the filter. It just makes them feel guilty for not being able to override it. Positive affectivity. Some people wake up with energy already humming. The day hasn't started yet, but they're ready for it. Optimistic. Engaged. Looking forward to what's next. It's not that nothing bothers them. It's that their baseline is set to active and enthusiastic. And that energy doesn't come from external circumstances. It comes from within. This is positive affectivity, a trait that governs how often and how intensely someone experiences positive emotions. People high in positive affectivity feel joy, excitement, interest more readily than others. They're not faking it. They're not manic. They're just wired to engage with the world in a way that skews positive. Their nervous system seeks activation. They're drawn to novelty, to social interaction, to challenge. Boredom doesn't feel like rest. It feels like deprivation. They need input, movement, stimulation. And when they get it, they light up. Conversations energize them. New projects excite them. Setbacks are frustrating, but they don't linger. The system resets to optimism quickly. This makes them pleasant to be around. They bring energy to groups. They're encouraging, enthusiastic, socially warm. In relationships, they're the ones initiating plans, suggesting adventures, keeping things moving. And their positivity can be contagious. People feel better after being around them because the mood they carry is genuinely uplifting. But there's a shadow side. High positive affectivity can mean underestimating risk. The optimism that makes them resilient can also make them reckless. They jump into things without fully considering the downside because the excitement overrides caution. And when reality doesn't match the expectation, the crash can be hard. They also struggle with people who operate differently. Low positive affectivity isn't depression. It's just a lower baseline for enthusiasm. But to someone high in the trait, that looks like negativity or disengagement. And they don't understand why others can't just choose to be more upbeat. The gap creates friction, where one person feels dragged down and the other feels pushed. Positive affectivity is an advantage in many contexts. It correlates with resilience, social success, subjective well-being. But like all traits, it's not purely good. It's a pattern, and patterns have costs. The question is whether the energy it brings is worth the risks it creates. Impulsivity. The item is on sale. You don't need it. You weren't even looking for it. But it's right there, and the price is good, and before you've thought it through, you've bought it. By the time you get home, you're already wondering why. The answer is simple. You didn't decide. You reacted. Impulsivity is acting without thinking. Not occasionally. Consistently. The gap between impulse and action is so narrow that there's no space for deliberation. You feel the urge and you follow it. The consequences don't register until after the behavior has already happened. The mechanism is a failure of inhibition. Most people have a pause button between wanting something and doing something. Impulsivity means that button doesn't work reliably. The desire arrives, and the action follows almost immediately. There's no weighing of pros and cons. No consideration of future impact. Just the pull of the moment and the response to it. This shows up everywhere. You say things you regret because the filter between thought and speech is weak. You quit jobs on a whim because the frustration in the moment outweighs the need for stability. You spend money you don't have because the immediate satisfaction overrides the future cost. Each decision feels right in the instant. The regret comes later. Relationships suffer. Impulsive anger leads to fights that didn't need to happen. Impulsive decisions create chaos that others have to manage. And people stop trusting you, not because you're malicious, but because your behavior is unpredictable. They can't rely on you to think things through before acting. And the long-term damage accumulates. Financial instability. Burned bridges. Opportunities lost because you couldn't delay gratification long enough to see them through. Impulsivity isn't about being spontaneous or adventurous. It's about being unable to stop yourself. And when the brake doesn't work, every decision becomes a risk. Delay discounting. Would you rather have $100 now or $200 in a year? The rational answer is obvious. Wait. Double your money. But for some people, that calculation doesn't work. The future reward, no matter how much larger, feels abstract, distant, not real. And the immediate reward, even if it's smaller, feels concrete. So they take it. Now, this preference for immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards is called delay discounting. And the degree to which someone discounts the future varies widely. For some people, a year might as well be forever. The reward loses almost all its value just because it's not available right now. For others, waiting is easy. The future is vivid enough that delaying feels worth it. The trait predicts a lot. People who discount the future steeply struggle with saving money. Why put away income now for retirement that's decades away? The future self feels like a stranger, and the present need feels urgent. So they spend. And when the future arrives, they're unprepared. It affects health too. Exercise pays off months or years down the line. The discomfort is immediate, so they skip it. Eating well has long-term benefits. The pleasure of unhealthy food is right now. So they choose the present, and the consequences build slowly in the background until they can't be ignored. And relationships crack under it. Long-term commitment requires sacrificing some immediate freedom for future stability. But if the future doesn't feel real, the sacrifice feels pointless. So they leave when things get hard, chase novelty when things get routine, and wonder why nothing lasts. The pattern isn't about not caring. It's about the future not weighing enough in the decision. Delay discounting isn't a moral failing. It's a calculation error. The future isn't less valuable. It just feels less real, and when the present always wins, the life you build is optimized for now. Not for later. Need for cognition. Two people are handed the same puzzle. One dives in immediately, intrigued by the challenge, excited to work through it. The other glances at it and sets it aside. Too much effort. Not worth the mental energy. Same puzzle. Completely different responses. The difference isn't intelligence. It's appetite. Some people are drawn to thinking, not just when necessary, but for its own sake. They enjoy complex problems. They seek out difficult ideas. They don't just tolerate mental effort. They crave it. This attraction to cognitive engagement is called need for cognition. And it shapes how people approach everything from conversations to careers. People high in need for cognition don't skim. They dig. When presented with information, they don't just accept it. They analyze it. They ask questions. They look for inconsistencies, not because they're skeptical by nature, but because engaging deeply with ideas is satisfying. The process of thinking isn't a chore. It's enjoyable. This shows up in how they spend time. They read dense material for fun. They debate for the pleasure of working through arguments. They take on intellectually demanding projects, not because they have to, because the challenge is rewarding. Mental effort isn't something to minimize. It's something to seek out. Low need for cognition operates differently. Thinking is fine when necessary, but it's not intrinsically rewarding. Shortcuts are preferred. Summaries are better than full texts. Simple explanations are better than complex ones. Not because they can't handle complexity, but because the effort isn't worth it when a simpler version gets the job done. The gap creates friction. High need for cognition sees depth as valuable. Low need for cognition sees it as inefficient. One wants to explore every angle. The other wants the bottom line. And neither understands why the other can't see the obvious value in their approach. Need for cognition isn't about being smart. It's about whether thinking feels like work or play. And that changes everything about how you engage with the world. Absorption. You're reading a book, and suddenly an hour has passed. You didn't notice. You weren't keeping track. You were inside the story so completely that the room around you disappeared. Time collapsed. The boundary between you and the narrative dissolved. And when you finally surface, it feels like waking up. Some people enter this state easily. Movies pull them in. Music transports them. Conversations absorb them so fully that everything else fades. They're not daydreaming. They're immersed. And the immersion isn't something they control. It happens to them. This capacity for deep, focused involvement in experience is called absorption. It's a trait that governs how fully someone can lose themselves in an activity. And for people high in absorption, the world doesn't just capture their attention. It swallows it. The experience is total. When they're absorbed, distractions don't register. External noise disappears. Self-awareness fades. There's no internal commentary, no awareness of time passing. Just the experience itself, unfiltered and consuming. And when it's over, they come back to themselves slowly, almost disoriented. This makes certain experiences more intense. Art hits harder. Stories feel more real. Emotions during absorption aren't just felt. They're lived. And the depth of engagement creates a richness that people low in absorption don't access as easily. But it also creates vulnerability. Absorption means boundaries weaken. You take in everything without the usual filters. And if what you're absorbing is negative, someone else's anger, a disturbing scene, a painful memory, it doesn't stay at a distance. It gets inside, and it's harder to shake off. People low in absorption stay more grounded. They enjoy things, but they don't disappear into them. There's always a part of them that stays aware, observing, maintaining separation. It's protective. But it also means they miss the depth of immersion. The world stays outside. It doesn't consume them. Absorption is neither good nor bad. It's a way of engaging. And whether it's an asset or a liability depends on what you're absorbing. Resilience. Resilience isn't about not falling. Everyone falls. It's about what happens next. Some people stay down longer. They spiral. They struggle to find footing. Others get back up quickly. Not because nothing hurt, but because something in them resists staying broken. This capacity to recover from adversity is resilience. And it's not the same as toughness. Toughness is not feeling the hit. Resilience is feeling it and bouncing back anyway. It's the ability to absorb damage without collapsing. To experience loss, failure, trauma, and still find a way forward. Resilient people don't avoid pain. They process it differently. When something goes wrong, they don't catastrophize. They assess what can be controlled, what needs to change, what can be let go. The emotional response is there, but it doesn't dominate. It gets integrated, not magnified. And they adapt. When one path closes, they look for another. Not because they're optimistic, but because staying stuck feels worse than trying something new. Flexibility is built into the system. Rigid expectations break under pressure. Resilient people bend. This shows up after setbacks. A job loss doesn't become an identity crisis. A relationship ending doesn't become evidence of permanent unworthiness. The event is painful, but it's contained. It doesn't spread into a narrative about everything being ruined. And that containment is what allows recovery. Low resilience doesn't mean weakness. It means the system gets overwhelmed more easily. A setback doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes. The recovery takes longer because the foundation shakes. And each new hit feels like confirmation that nothing will ever be okay again. The spiral tightens, and climbing out requires more effort than the resilient person needs to expend. Resilience can be built. It's not fixed. But it requires practice in the exact thing that's hardest, facing difficulty without collapsing. And that's not something you learn in theory. You learn it by surviving what you thought would break you. Grit. Watch two people start the same difficult project. Both are excited. Both are committed. Both believe it matters. But 6 months in, when the excitement has faded and the difficulty hasn't, only one is still working on it. The other has moved on, found something new, something easier, something that doesn't require this much sustained effort. The person who stayed doesn't have more talent. They have more grit. The ability to stick with long-term goals even when progress is slow. Obstacles are constant and the rewards are distant. It's not about working hard in bursts. It's about working consistently over years and not giving up when it gets boring. Grit combines two elements: passion and perseverance. Passion is knowing what you want. Perseverance is staying with it when the path is harder than expected. And most people have one without the other. They're passionate but quit when it's hard. Or they're persistent but lack direction. Grit is both at once. The key difference is time horizon. People without grit optimize for the present. When a project stops being fun, they move on. When progress stalls, they switch to something easier. They're not lazy. They're just not built to endure long stretches of difficulty for distant payoffs. People with grit measure success differently. Progress isn't about how it feels today. It's about whether they're closer to the goal than they were last year. Setbacks aren't failures. They're part of the process. And quitting isn't an option they seriously consider, even when everything in them wants to stop. This doesn't make them happy. Long-term goals mean long-term discomfort. They spend years working on things that don't pay off yet. They sacrifice immediate pleasure for future achievement. And they watch other people move on to easier, faster wins while they're still grinding through the hard part. But in the end, grit is what separates the people who finish from the people who start. Talent gets you in the door. Grit keeps you in the room long after everyone else has left. Self-compassion. When a friend makes a mistake, you're kind. You reassure them. You remind them that everyone messes up. But when you make the same mistake, the response is different. You're harsh, critical, unforgiving. The compassion you extend to others doesn't apply to yourself. And you don't even question why. Most people treat themselves worse than they'd treat anyone else. They hold themselves to standards they'd never impose on a friend. They speak to themselves in ways they'd never speak to someone they care about. And when they fail, the self-criticism is automatic, brutal, relentless. Self-compassion is the opposite of that pattern. It's treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer to others, not excusing mistakes, not lowering standards, just recognizing that failure is part of being human and responding to it with understanding instead of contempt. People low in self-compassion don't see mistakes as normal. They see them as proof of inadequacy. So when something goes wrong, the internal voice turns vicious. You always do this. You're incompetent. You should have known better. The criticism doesn't motivate. It just amplifies the shame. And the shame creates paralysis. If failure means you're worthless, then trying becomes dangerous. Because what if you fail again? The risk isn't just the failure itself. It's the confirmation of everything you already believe about yourself. So you avoid. You shrink. You don't take chances. And the self-criticism, meant to push you toward improvement, actually keeps you stuck. Self-compassion breaks that cycle. It allows failure without self-destruction. A mistake is just a mistake. It's not evidence of fundamental brokenness. And when the internal voice shifts from "you're terrible" to "this is hard and it's okay to struggle," the shame loses its grip. You're not letting yourself off the hook. You're just treating yourself like someone worth caring for. Trait mindfulness. You're walking, but you're not really there. Your body is moving, but your mind is somewhere else. Replaying yesterday's conversation. Planning tomorrow's meeting. Anywhere but here. And by the time you arrive, you don't remember the walk. You were on autopilot the entire time. Most people live this way. Present physically, but mentally elsewhere. Constantly pulled into the past or the future. Rarely fully engaged with what's happening right now. The moment arrives and they're already gone. Thinking about what comes next. Worrying about what came before. never quite landing in the present. Trait mindfulness is the opposite. It's the natural tendency to pay attention to the present moment without judgment. Not as a practice you have to force, as a baseline way of being. People high in trait mindfulness aren't constantly drifting. They're here, noticing what's happening, experiencing it directly instead of through a filter of thoughts about it. This shows up in small moments. They taste their food instead of eating while distracted. They hear what you're saying instead of planning their response while you talk. They notice their own emotions as they arise instead of being swept away by them hours later. The present moment isn't something they have to work to access. It's where they already are. And this creates a different relationship with stress. When you're fully present, problems don't spiral as easily. You're dealing with what's actually happening, not what might happen or what you're afraid will happen. The mental noise quiets. Not because the problem's disappeared, but because you're not adding layers of worry on top of them. Low trait mindfulness means living in your head. The present is just a backdrop for the thoughts running constantly. And those thoughts pull you away from the very experiences that could ground you. You're here, but you're not. And the life you're living passes by while you're somewhere else entirely. Optimism. Optimism isn't about ignoring problems. It's not toxic positivity or pretending everything's fine when it's not. It's a belief that things will work out. Not because they always do, but because focusing on the possibility of success feels better than fixating on failure. And that belief shapes everything. When optimists face setbacks, they don't spiral. They adjust. A rejection isn't proof they're not good enough. It's one outcome in a process that will eventually work. A failure isn't a permanent state. It's temporary. Something went wrong this time. Next time might be different. The future isn't fixed. It's open. This doesn't mean they're blind to reality. They see the obstacles. They just don't assume the obstacles are insurmountable. Where a pessimist sees a closed door and gives up, an optimist sees a closed door and looks for a window. The effort feels worth it because the outcome still seems possible. And this affects health. Optimists recover from illness faster. Not because positive thinking cures disease, but because the belief that recovery is possible motivates the behaviors that support it. They follow treatment. They stay engaged. They don't give up when progress is slow. The optimism isn't magic. It's fuel. Relationships benefit too. Optimists assume good intent. A partner's bad mood isn't a sign the relationship is failing. It's just a bad day. Conflict isn't the beginning of the end. It's something to work through. And that assumption creates space for repair. Pessimists see the same conflict and start preparing for the breakup. But optimism has a cost. It can lead to underestimating risk, taking on more than is reasonable because the belief that it will work out overrides the evidence that it won't. And when reality doesn't match the expectation, the crash is hard, because the optimism that protected them from despair also kept them from seeing the warning signs. Pessimism. The world is full of risks. Things go wrong constantly. Plans fall apart. People let you down. And the safest response is to expect it. Not because you're cynical, but because preparation feels better than disappointment. If you assume the worst, you're never caught off guard. And when things go right, it's a pleasant surprise instead of a shattered expectation. This is pessimism, not depression, not hopelessness. Just a default assumption that outcomes will skew negative. And for people high in pessimism, this assumption isn't a choice. It's how the mind organizes probability. The brain scans for threats, highlights risks, and downplays the chances of success. Not to torture you, to protect you. But the protection comes at a cost. When you assume things will go wrong, you stop trying. Why apply for the job if you won't get it? Why start the project if it will fail? The pessimism meant to shield you from disappointment ends up creating the exact outcome you feared. Because you never gave success a chance. Relationships suffer under this weight. A partner's silence isn't just silence. It's evidence they're losing interest. A friend's cancelled plan isn't a schedule conflict. It's proof they don't care. The pessimism reinterprets neutral events as negative, and the constant expectation of abandonment pushes people away. Not because they wanted to leave, but because the relationship became exhausting to maintain. And the internal experience is draining. Living with pessimism means living with dread. Every good thing comes with the waiting. Waiting for it to fall apart. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. You can't fully enjoy what's working because you're already bracing for when it stops. And the future isn't something to look forward to. It's something to survive. Pessimism isn't about being realistic. Realism weighs probabilities. Pessimism assumes the worst probability will win. And when that's your baseline, the world confirms it. Not because the world is worse for you, but because you've filtered out everything that contradicts the assumption. Normative male alexithymia. Why is it that when a man is asked how he's feeling, the answer is often fine, I don't know? Not because he's hiding something, but because the question itself feels foreign. Emotions aren't something he's been taught to identify, name, or talk about. And over time, that lack of practice becomes a lack of ability. This isn't the clinical inability to recognize emotions. It's a learned pattern. A socialization process where boys are taught that emotions are weakness, that talking about feelings is unnecessary, that the only acceptable emotional expression is anger or nothing. And after years of that training, the internal language for emotions just doesn't develop. The result looks like alexithymia, but the cause is different. It's not neurological, it's cultural. Men aren't born unable to process emotions. They're taught to suppress them so consistently that eventually they lose access. The system is there. It's just been shut down. And this creates real problems. In relationships, emotional intimacy requires being able to name what you feel. But if you don't have the vocabulary, you can't communicate. Your partner asks what's wrong, and you genuinely don't know. Not because you're withholding, because the internal signal that says, I'm hurt or I'm scared, never got translated into words. So the emotions come out sideways, as irritability, as withdrawal, as physical symptoms. The feeling is there, but it has no outlet. And the people around you are left guessing, frustrated, trying to decode what you can't articulate because you were never given the tools. The tragedy is that this isn't fixed. It's learned, which means it can be unlearned. But that requires doing the exact thing that feels most uncomfortable, sitting with the feeling long enough to figure out what it is. And after a lifetime of being told not to, that's not a switch you flip. It's a skill you have to build from scratch. Jealousy proneness. Your partner talks to someone attractive at a party. It's casual, friendly, nothing inappropriate. But the feeling starts anyway. A tightness in your chest. A spike of insecurity. By the time the conversation ends, you've already imagined the worst. And even though nothing happened, the jealousy lingers. For some people, jealousy is rare, a fleeting response to actual threats. For others, it's constant. Every interaction your partner has with someone else feels like competition. Every compliment they receive feels like a sign they're drifting. The jealousy isn't rational, but it's real. And it's exhausting. Jealousy proneness is the tendency to experience jealousy frequently and intensely. It's not the same as having a reason to be jealous. It's feeling jealous even when there's no threat. The emotion triggers easily, builds quickly, and doesn't fade just because you know it's unfounded. The mechanism is rooted in insecurity. If you believe you're not enough, then anyone else looks like a replacement. Your partner doesn't just have friends. They have options. And every option feels like evidence that eventually they'll choose someone else. The jealousy isn't about them. It's about the fear that you're not worth staying for. And this fear drives behaviors that damage the relationship. You check their phone. You question their whereabouts. You get upset over interactions that shouldn't matter. Not because you don't trust them. Because you don't trust that you're enough to keep them. And the constant monitoring, the accusations, the insecurity, it pushes them away. The jealousy meant to keep them close becomes the thing that drives them out. Breaking jealousy proneness isn't about trusting your partner more. It's about trusting yourself. That you're worth staying for. That their attention isn't the only thing validating your worth. And that other people existing in their life doesn't erase you from it. But when the jealousy has been running the show for years, quieting it feels impossible. Because the fear it's protecting you from is the one you've believed longest. Envy proneness. A coworker gets promoted. You congratulate them. You smile. You say the right things. But underneath, something else is happening. A bitter taste, a tightness, not happiness for them, resentment. Because they got something you wanted, and now the gap between you feels unbearable. Envy isn't jealousy. Jealousy is about protecting what you have. Envy is about wanting what someone else has. And for some people, that wanting turns corrosive. They don't just notice other people's success. They feel diminished by it. Every achievement someone else reaches feels like proof of their own inadequacy. People high in envy proneness don't celebrate wins. They catalogue them. Who has more? Who's doing better? Who's getting ahead? And each comparison stings. Not because they're cruel, but because the success of others highlights what they don't have. And that gap becomes unbearable. The emotion isn't productive. It doesn't motivate. It just festers. You can't be happy for people because their happiness reminds you of your own lack. You can't enjoy your own achievements because someone always has more. The envy poisons both the relationships and the satisfaction you might otherwise feel. And it isolates. People sense it. The lack of genuine warmth when they share good news. The subtle competitiveness. The way their success makes you withdraw instead of engage. And slowly they stop sharing. Not because they're cruel. Because your envy makes connection feel unsafe. Breaking envy proneness requires separating someone else's gain from your own loss. Their success doesn't erase yours. Their achievement doesn't diminish your worth. But when the comparison is automatic, when every win feels like a reminder of what you're missing, that separation feels impossible. Because the envy isn't about them. It's about the story you're telling yourself about not being enough. Rumination tendency. The conversation ended hours ago. But you're still replaying it. What you said. What they said. What you should have said instead. Over and over. Turning it around in your mind, examining every angle, unable to let it go. And the more you replay it, the worse it feels. Most people can move on. They think about it once, maybe twice, then let it go. But for some people, thoughts loop. The same worries. The same regrets. The same scenarios playing on repeat. This repetitive, unproductive focus on problems is called rumination. And it doesn't solve anything. It just deepens the groove. Rumination feels like problem solving. You're analyzing, thinking it through, trying to understand, but real problem solving moves toward action. Rumination just circles. You revisit the same thoughts without getting closer to resolution. And the repetition doesn't bring clarity. It brings exhaustion. The pattern shows up everywhere. A mistake at work becomes a mental loop that runs for days. A conflict with a friend replays endlessly, each replay making the hurt sharper. A worry about the future spirals into every possible worst-case scenario, none of which you can control but all of which you keep examining. And relationships suffer. When you're stuck in rumination, you're not present. Your mind is elsewhere, replaying what went wrong or worrying about what might. People can't reach you because you're trapped in the loop. And the emotional distance that creates confirms the very fears that started the rumination in the first place. Breaking rumination requires interrupting the loop. Not by solving the problem, by recognizing that replaying it isn't helping. But when the mind has been running the same track for hours, for days or years, stopping feels impossible. Because the rumination has convinced you that if you just think about it one more time, you'll finally figure it out. You won't. But the loop doesn't care. Social comparison orientation. Some people check their own progress by looking inward. Am I better than I was last year? Am I meeting my own standards? But others can't help but look sideways. How am I doing compared to them? Am I ahead or behind? The measuring stick isn't internal, it's external. And it never stops moving. This constant habit of evaluating yourself against others is called social comparison orientation. And for people high in this trait, comparison isn't occasional. It's automatic. Every interaction becomes an assessment. Who's smarter? Who's more successful? Who's happier? Who's more attractive? The comparison happens before conscious thought can stop it, and the comparison skew negative. You don't notice the people doing worse. You fixate on the people doing better. So no matter where you are, someone is always ahead. And that gap feels personal, not just a difference, a deficit. This drains satisfaction. You get a promotion, but someone else got a bigger one. You finish a project, but someone else's was more impressive. You can't enjoy your own progress because the comparison has already shifted the baseline. And what should feel like success feels like falling short. Relationships become competitive. Even friendships carry an undertone of measurement. Who's doing better in their career? Whose relationship is stronger? Whose life looks more fulfilling? And the comparison doesn't bring you closer. It creates distance. Because connection requires celebrating each other. And comparison makes that impossible. Social comparison orientation isn't about ambition. Ambition drives you forward. Comparison pulls you sideways into a contest you can't win. Because the benchmark keeps moving, and the person you're measuring yourself against is doing the same thing. So nobody wins. Everyone just stays exhausted. Ambiguity tolerance. Life is full of uncertainty. Situations that don't have clear answers. Relationships that exist in gray zones. Outcomes that won't be known for months or years. And how you handle that uncertainty says a lot about how you navigate the world. Some people need clarity. Ambiguity makes them uncomfortable. They want definitions, labels, clear paths. When things are vague, they push for resolution. Not because they're controlling, but because the not knowing creates tension they can't tolerate. This low tolerance for ambiguity drives them to close open questions as quickly as possible. Others sit in the gray more easily. Uncertainty doesn't feel threatening. It feels normal. They can hold multiple possibilities at once without needing to collapse them into one answer. They don't rush decisions because the discomfort of not deciding isn't overwhelming. They wait. They see what develops. They stay flexible. The difference shows up everywhere. In relationships, high ambiguity tolerance means you can be undefined for a while. You don't need to label it immediately. You're comfortable with, let's see where this goes. Low tolerance means you need to know. Are we dating or not? Where is this heading? The ambiguity feels like instability, and stability requires definition. At work, high tolerance means you can operate in environments where the goals shift, the structure is loose, the feedback is unclear. You adapt. You improvise. Low tolerance means you need clear expectations, defined roles, predictable outcomes. And when those aren't present, the stress builds. Neither is better. High tolerance can mean drifting too long without making necessary decisions. Low tolerance can mean forcing clarity before it's earned. But the gap between them creates friction. One person's "will figure it out" is the other person's nightmare. And both wonder why the other can't see the obvious risk in their approach. Locus of control. Two people fail the same test. One says, "I didn't study enough." The other says, "The test was unfair." Same outcome. Completely different explanations. The first person locates the cause internally. The second locates it externally. And that difference shapes everything. Locus of control is where you believe control sits. Internal locus means you see outcomes as driven by your choices, your effort, your decisions. External locus means you see them as driven by luck, other people, circumstances beyond your control. And that belief determines how you respond to both success and failure. People with internal locus take responsibility. When something goes wrong, they ask what they could have done differently. When something goes right, they attribute it to their actions. This makes them more likely to try again after failure, because failure is something they can address. It wasn't random. It was the result of choices they can change. External locus protects the ego but limits growth. If failure is always someone else's fault, you never have to confront your own mistakes. But you also never learn from them. And if success is always luck, you can't replicate it. You're just waiting for the next lucky break. The pattern affects everything. Internal locus correlates with higher achievement. Not because these people are smarter, but because they believe effort matters. So they put in effort. External locus correlates with helplessness. If outcomes are outside your control, why bother trying? The effort won't change anything. Relationships crack under this divide. One person sees problems as solvable through communication and effort. The other sees them as inevitable or caused by forces they can't influence. And the gap in how they approach conflict makes resolution almost impossible. Because you can't fix what you believe you can't control. Locus of control isn't entirely fixed. But shifting it requires changing a deeply held belief about how the world works. And that's not something you do by deciding to. It's something you do by repeatedly experiencing the connection between your actions and the outcomes. Until the belief updates. Or it doesn't. Hardiness. Hardiness isn't about not feeling stress. It's about how you interpret it. Two people face the same pressure. One sees it as a threat that might break them. The other sees it as a challenge they can handle. Same situation, different frame. And that frame changes everything. People high in hardness have three core beliefs. Commitment. They're engaged with life, not just going through the motions. Control. They believe their actions matter, that they can influence outcomes even when circumstances are hard. Challenge. They see difficulties as opportunities to grow, not as disasters to avoid. And those beliefs create resilience that goes beyond toughness. When stress hits, hardy people don't collapse. They lean in. A job loss isn't the end of their career. It's a forced reset. A health scare isn't proof life is fragile. It's a reminder to engage more fully. They're not denying the difficulty. They're refusing to let it define them. This doesn't mean they don't struggle. Hardness isn't invulnerability. It's the ability to struggle without breaking. To experience pain without letting it become an identity. To face setbacks without assuming they're permanent. And the difference compounds. People low in hardness avoid challenges because challenges feel threatening. But avoidance limits growth. So they stay stuck. Hardy people seek challenges because challenges feel meaningful. And that engagement creates the exact skills that make future challenges more manageable. The resilience builds on itself. Relationships benefit too. Hardy people don't catastrophize conflict. They don't assume problems mean the relationship is doomed. They see conflict as something to work through. And that belief makes them more likely to stay engaged when things get hard, which means they build stronger relationships. Not because they have fewer problems, but because they don't interpret problems as proof of failure. Hardiness can be developed, but it requires reframing stress, not as something happening to you, but as something you're navigating. And that shift doesn't happen by trying harder. It happens by repeatedly experiencing difficulty and discovering that you're still standing on the other side.